So my name is Jonathan, and this is my story. So my mom and dad were both missionaries who then became pastors. We moved to the South Bay. They raised my older brother and I, and we grew up Christian since day one. I feel like a lot of my identity and who I was and my beliefs kind of stemmed from my parents. I think that's kind of where the story starts developing. A lot of who I am kind of is credited to who my mom and dad were. Even my friends, like, oh, you're Pastor Eli's son, or you're Pastor Diana's son. But I felt like I never really found who I am, who is Jonathan. You know, I think that's where the issue really began, and it kind of stemmed over to kind of going to school. I remember being taken out of my middle school that I had just gotten into, and we moved to a new city, a brand new school, and I was already dealing with like identity, like who am I? Like, am I just like my mom and dad's kid? Am I just, you know, some church boy, you know, who just happened to lose all his friends now because he's about to get into a new school? And there I am at this new school trying to just figure out, like, how am I supposed to fit in? How am I supposed to like find identity? So my dad and I think my relationship with my dad was a little difficult. I felt like he and I didn't really connect as much as he did with my brother. I'm not sure, even to this day, I'm not sure where that might have came from. It could have been my own thoughts that I felt like I wasn't appreciated. I felt like my dad was always too busy for me. I felt like he was always at church, and I mean he was a busy guy, but I felt like our relationship was a little, I don't know, severed. I think it felt for me that he just didn't make time for me, or it didn't spend enough time, you know, hanging out with me. My mom and dad had actually separated when I was 13, and my dad had other kids in a previous marriage, and he felt the need to reconnect with his other kids, and that further separated him from my mom and from the relationship he had with my brother and I, and then once he moved, he actually found out he had cancer, and I think that scare for him kind of put it all, you know, into perspective, and that's when he really started reaching out to me and trying to make amends for all the years that, you know, he really didn't spend those quality moments with me. It was probably the following year, once he had moved away. I was 14 years old, and I remember him picking me up from school a few times, and us, you know, talking, and him kind of explaining himself and all the loss of moments that we could have shared, and because he was so busy, because he had put other things before me, and you know, and I think we were able to finally like connect and make amends, you know, when I was 14. So when I was 14, my dad, he sadly, he passed away. It was a rough time for our family, rough time for me. I felt like we were barely starting to connect, even though he wasn't living with us, and even though the separation had taken place between him and my mom, and I felt like when he passed away, I felt like a piece of me, you know, part of me, you know, kind of was torn, and there was a void, you know, that I didn't think could ever be filled, and it further separated me from myself, and finding who I was, you know, like my identity. I felt like I was finally finding my identity, you know, in my dad, and the conversations that he ended up having with me, you know, that year, you know, and for him to not be around anymore, to not tell me that he was proud of me, to not tell me that, that he loved me, that he cared for me, I think that made it harder to bear. With me realizing that my dad's not around, I remember my mom always telling me that even if you don't have a physical father, a biological father with you present in your life, that God is our Father, and He's your Father. I remember her telling me that, and I remember kind of dismissing that at first and not really paying attention. I think I wanted to jump into a rebellious phase, where I didn't care, like why would God take away, my dad, and why would God allow for all this to happen? And I felt like at some point I began to listen to what my mom was saying, and I began to understand what that meant, that God was my Father and that God cared for all of His children, even those who had no biological or physical father present in their lives. I found out in Scripture, how He is a father to the fatherless, and I think I started really owning up to what the Bible was telling me and what these words began to make me feel and know and value. So 14, 15, I was still a bit confused. I knew that God was my Father, and I knew that I needed to open up, dialogue and communication with God and work on my relationship with God. And so I tried a few years. There were, some bad turns here and there. I got into some pretty, bad, impulsive decision-making. Got into some bad relationships. Eventually, I finally found, my wife, who at the time was just a good friend of mine. We met. I actually credit her for getting me my first job because I didn't really have a lot going on. I was a college dropout. I was going in and out of jobs, and once I met her, she really kind of honed in on living purposefully, and I ended up getting engaged. We got married 2015. That very same year, we decided to have a baby. 9 months later, we had our first boy. His name's Liam. He's 4 years old now. And as of right now, I find myself a lot happier, a lot joyful. I felt like my relationship with God has grown, has gotten better as I've encountered a deeper relationship with Him. Also with my wife and my family, I felt like God has now kind of brought everything back, and I finally found my identity in God, not in myself, not in anyone else, but in God.
Jonathan, how has Jesus changed everything?
He changed everything by putting my entire life, my world in perspective. I realized that no matter who I tried to impress, no matter what I tried to do, the extent of me going to the outermost parts to try to figure out who I am, it didn't matter until I came to Him, until God became the focus, until I realized that His love towards me, what He did on the cross for me, and what that symbolized in my life, for my family, for my wife, for my son, for me, like I feel like that changed everything. He changed everything by allowing me to realize that without Him, I would be nothing. I would feel like nothing, and so He became my everything. God is for you. He is a father to the fatherless. If you're struggling with identity, that if it stems from your upbringing, from not having a dad or a mom in the picture, even then it doesn't matter. God is your Father, and He loves you, and He is for you, and He has a plan to work all things for your good.